Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. In the unforgiving winters of the American frontier, when snow piled high against cabin doors and trails vanished beneath white blankets stretching to the horizon, the difference between survival and starvation often came down to one crucial element: the meat supply. For countless pioneer families who ventured westward throughout the 1800s, their existence balanced precariously on the preparations they made before winter's grip tightened. Yet among these resilient settlers, a remarkable divergence in practices emerged. Those who relied solely on the traditional preservation method using salt, and those who, through necessity or foresight, mastered techniques to preserve their meat without this precious commodity. The historical record shows that by the particularly harsh winter of 1837, in the remote settlements of northern Ohio's Western Reserve, these different approaches would be tested beyond measure. What unfolded there would expose the fragility of frontier life and illuminate how the knowledge of meat preservation without salt, once dismissed as primitive or unnecessary, would prove instrumental to survival, forever changing how these communities prepared for winter's inevitable return. Our story begins not with dramatic conflict, but with something far more mundane: the price of salt at Chadwick's General Store in the small settlement of Millfield, Ohio, in the autumn of 1836. At $4 per barrel, nearly a month's wages for the average laborer, salt had become inexplicably scarce that season. Shipping manifests from Cleveland Harbor, preserved in county records, show several salt shipments diverted to eastern markets where prices had risen even higher. This seemingly insignificant market fluctuation would set in motion a chain of events that would test the resolve of dozens of families and ultimately save or condemn them based on something few had considered: alternative methods of preserving their winter meat supply. The Millfield settlement had been established nearly 2 decades earlier, populated primarily by families from New England and a smaller contingent of German immigrants who had arrived within the previous 5 years. The community's hunting and food preservation practices reflected this cultural blend, though most relied heavily on traditional salt-curing methods for their meat, a practice so common that few questioned its primacy or considered alternatives. The Chadwick Ledger from September 12, 1836, still preserved in the County Historical Archives, tells a story beyond simple commerce. Page after page documents the usual transactions: fabric purchased by the yard, ammunition by the pound, tools replaced or repaired. But a notable pattern emerges in the entries beginning mid-month: increasingly anxious inquiries about salt supplies. The ledger notes one entry on September 17th. E. Whitman requests notice when salt barrels arrive, willing to pay in advance. Similar notations follow, marking the gradual recognition of a developing problem. Samuel Chadwick's personal correspondence with his Cleveland supplier, dated September 23rd, reveals his growing concern. Customers inquire daily regarding salt shipments. Please advise soonest on expected delivery. Some families delaying butchering in anticipation. The reply, dated October 2nd, delivers unwelcome news. Salt diverted to Albany markets. Prices there commanding 30% premium. Limited supply may reach Ohio by late October. Cannot guarantee quantities. This exchange, preserved through the foresight of Chadwick's granddaughter, who donated his papers to the Historical Society in 1902, captures the moment when a routine supply issue began its transformation into a potential crisis. What's particularly notable is that neither Chadwick nor his customers immediately considered alternatives to salt preservation. Their correspondence reveals an assumption that salt would eventually arrive, perhaps at higher prices, but that the fundamental approach to winter meat preservation would remain unchanged. Yet along the eastern ridge, in 3 modest homesteads set slightly apart from the main settlement, lived the families who would become central to our story. The Webers, German immigrants who had arrived in 1831, the Parkers, originally from Vermont, who had lived briefly among Shawnee communities before settling in Millfield, and the Hendersons, a family whose patriarch Thomas had spent years as a fur trapper in the Northern Territories. These 3 families, through circumstance and experience, practiced meat preservation methods that diverged significantly from their neighbors, methods that didn't rely on the increasingly precious commodity of salt. Johann Weber, a barrel maker by trade who had emigrated from Bavaria, had brought with him not only his craftsman's tools, but generations of knowledge about meat smoking techniques developed in the Black Forest region. His family correspondence, translated from German and preserved by his descendants, reveals that Weber had constructed his distinctive smokehouse within months of establishing his homestead. A letter to his brother in Bavaria, dated November 1831, notes, "The smokehouse stands complete, built precisely as Father taught us. The neighbors watch with curiosity, but maintain their own ways. They rely too heavily on salt, which seems plentiful now, but could one day become dear." This prescient observation, made 5 years before the salt shortage would prove him right, demonstrates Weber's awareness of the vulnerability in the community's dependency on a single preservation method. His smokehouse, unlike the simpler smoking setups occasionally used by other settlers as a complement to salting, was designed specifically for long-term preservation without salt. The structure, described in detail in Weber's correspondence and later documented by agricultural researchers in the 1850s, featured careful control of smoke density, temperature regulation through adjustable vents, and specific wood selection for optimal preservation compounds. Elizabeth Parker's journey to alternative preservation methods followed a different path. Township records show the Parker family arrived in Millfield in 1833 after spending 3 years in a settlement near Shawnee Territories in southern Ohio. Elizabeth's diary, a remarkable document that survived through her granddaughter's preservation efforts, reveals that during this period of proximity to Shawnee communities, she had developed a keen interest in their food preservation techniques. Her diary entry from August 1829, written while still living near the Shawnee, shows her first encounter with pemmican. Observe the women preparing winter provisions today. Their method for preserving meat involves no salt whatsoever, but rather complete drying followed by mixing with rendered fat. They call it something I cannot properly spell, but it keeps through winter and beyond. The women were amused by my interest, but graciously demonstrated their technique. Subsequent entries document her attempts to replicate the process, initial failures, and eventual mastery under the guidance of a Shawnee woman she identifies only as Morning Sky, who spoke enough English to explain the critical details Elizabeth had missed in her first attempts. By the time the Parker family relocated to Millfield, Elizabeth had fully incorporated this technique into her family's winter preparation practices, though she rarely discussed it with neighbors who seemed satisfied with their salt preservation methods. Thomas Henderson's background as a fur trapper had exposed him to yet another approach to meat preservation without salt. County records show Henderson settled in Millfield in 1830 after nearly 15 years, working northern trapping routes from the Great Lakes into Canadian territories. His account book from those years, containing not only financial records but personal notes and observations, documents his adoption of dry aging techniques learned from both French-Canadian trappers and indigenous peoples of the Northern Territories. A particularly detailed entry from January 1824, written while snowed in at a remote cabin near Lake Superior, describes the revelation of seeing properly dry-aged meat for the first time. Colbert hung 6 deer carcasses in the special shed last October. Today we ate from them, and the meat remains wholesome after 3 months without salt. He laughed at my surprise, saying his grandfather taught him thus. The shed allows the cold air to circulate, but keeps the meat from freezing solid and prevents snow contact. The outer surface dries to form a protective layer while the inner meat remains tender. Henderson's subsequent entries show his careful observation and gradual mastery of this technique, culminating in his construction of a similar dry aging structure when he eventually settled in Millfield. Like the Webbers and Parkers, Henderson occasionally mentioned his alternative preservation method to neighbors, but found little interest in techniques that deviated from the familiar salt-curing practices most settlers brought with them from eastern states. According to the township meeting minutes of September 1836, when Josiah Thornton, owner of the largest farm in the area, suggested the community pool resources to secure adequate salt supplies for winter preparation, he was met with general agreement. Only Thomas Henderson voiced concern, suggesting families consider alternative methods as a precaution. The minutes record his exact words, "Salt may fail us yet. There are other ways known to me that might serve us well to remember." The ledger notes his comment was received with polite acknowledgement, but little further discussion. This moment, captured in the dry language of official records, represents a critical missed opportunity. Henderson's attempted intervention, likely informed by his years of experience with unreliable supply lines in remote territories, went unheeded as the community maintained its focus on securing salt rather than exploring alternatives. The record shows no follow-up questions about what these other ways might entail, no curiosity about methods that might complement their existing practices, even as insurance against supply problems. By October, the salt shortage had become an undeniable reality. Chadwick's ledger shows that the promised shipment finally arrived on October 24th, but in quantities far below what the community required. An entry from that date records, "Salt barrels arrived from Cleveland, 6 only against orders for 22. Distributed according to previous commitments at $4.50 per barrel." Subsequent entries document increasing community anxiety as families realized the inadequate supply would require them to modify their butchering and preservation plans. A town meeting called on October 26th, again documented in township minutes, considered various approaches to the shortfall. The record shows proposals ranging from sending a community representative to Cleveland to negotiate additional supplies, to delaying some butchering until winter temperatures could naturally assist preservation, to rationing the available salt to ensure each family received some portion. Notably absent from the recorded discussion was any serious consideration of alternative preservation methods, despite Henderson's previous suggestion. The meeting concluded with a compromise approach. Families would receive salt allocations based on household size, supplemented by a community agreement to delay some butchering until December, when colder temperatures would require less salt for safe preservation. The minutes note, distribution to proceed as proposed by J. Thornton. T. Henderson abstained from vote, reiterating his suggestion that alternatives to salt preservation be considered. Motion carried nonetheless. By early November, most families had completed their fall butchering, with nearly every household following the traditional practice of salt packing their pork and beef, though using smaller quantities of salt than usual due to the rationing system. Meanwhile, on the ridge, different methods were being employed. The Webbers were smoking large portions of their meat using a technique brought from Bavaria. The Parkers were rendering fat and creating what Elizabeth Parker's diary referred to as journey cake, what we now recognize as pemmican, a preservation method she had learned during their time near Shawnee settlements. And the Hendersons were employing a method Thomas called dry aging, suspending meat in a specially constructed outdoor shed where cold air circulated freely. The contrast between these approaches was captured vividly in Elizabeth Parker's diary entry from November 12th. "From our hillside, one can observe the smoke from nearly every chimney in the valley, yet only Johann Weber's smokehouse produces the distinctive blue-white smoke that signifies proper meat preservation. The others burn their wood for warmth alone. their meat packed in precious salt that may prove insufficient before winter's end. Johann visited yesterday to compare observations on the smoking process. His Bavarian technique differs somewhat from mine, yet we both recognize the wisdom in avoiding complete dependence on salt. This entry reveals not only the physical distinction visible on the landscape, the special smoke from Weber's purpose-built structure, but also the beginning of knowledge sharing among the three families who practiced alternative preservation methods. While the main settlement remained focused on making their limited salt supplies last, these three households were engaged in a different kind of preparation, refining techniques that required no salt whatsoever. A remarkable document from this period is Johann Weber's detailed drawing of his smokehouse, preserved among family papers. The technical precision of the diagram reveals both his craftsman's training and the importance he placed on specific design elements. Careful notations in German identify the critical features: the offset firebox that allowed smoke to cool before reaching the meat, the series of baffles that distributed smoke evenly, the calibrated vents that maintained optimal temperature and humidity, and the specific heights for hanging different types of meat cuts. This drawing, later shared with neighbors during the winter crisis, would become a crucial reference as the community scrambled to replicate Weber's approach. The precision of his design, informed by generations of Black Forest smoking traditions, stands in stark contrast to the improvised smoking attempts that would later prove inadequate when attempted without proper understanding of the underlying principles. Elizabeth Parker's diary provides equally valuable documentation of her pemmican preparation, though in narrative rather than diagrammatic form. Her entry from November 8th walks through the process step by step. Began journey cake preparation today, sliced the venison across grain in strips no thicker than my small finger, arranged on stretched canvas frames in the attic where air circulates freely but screens prevent insects. Will turn daily until thoroughly dry, brittle enough to snap rather than bend. The drying requires patience. Many err in proceeding to the next step before the meat has released all moisture, which inevitably leads to spoilage. Subsequent entries detail the completion of the process: the careful pounding of the dried meat into a fine powder, the rendering of fat until completely clear of all tissue, and the precise mixing of ingredients. Her November 15th entry notes: final stage of journey cake, completed today. Mixed the meat powder with rendered deer fat, approximately equal portions by measure, though not by weight. Press the mixture firmly into birch containers, sealed with more fat along the seams. When spring arrives, this will taste as fresh as the day it was made, while requiring no precious salt in its making. Thomas Henderson's account book provides less detailed instructions on his dry aging technique, but includes critical observations about the conditions necessary for success. His entry from November 5th notes completed hanging of the deer quarters and smaller cuts in the aging house, positioned to ensure no piece touches another, allowing complete air circulation. Weather conditions favorable, cold but not freezing, humidity low. Critical to maintain temperature between 30 and 40 degrees to prevent freezing while inhibiting spoilage. Structures design performing as intended, drawing air continuously across the meat. A subsequent entry from November 20th records his monitoring process. Examined aging meat today. Outer surfaces developing proper dry casing as expected, approximately 1/4 inch depth. Interior remains moist and tender when probed. No signs of spoilage. Adjusted north vent to compensate for increased wind from that direction. Will continue daily inspection until process completes, approximately 3 to 4 more weeks, depending on weather conditions. These detailed records from the three Ridge families reveal not just the techniques themselves, but the careful attention and accumulated knowledge that made them effective. None of these methods were improvisations or desperate measures. Each represented generations of refined practice, adapted to local conditions through careful observation and adjustment. The tragedy unfolding in Millfield was that this knowledge remained largely confined to these 3 households, unshared with the broader community that saw no reason to deviate from familiar salt-curing methods despite the obvious supply constraints. The first snow fell early that year, with township records noting substantial accumulation by November 17th. By early December, snowfall had become uncommonly heavy, with Elizabeth Parker's diary entry from December 8th noting, "Snow beyond the fence posts now, 3rd day, without sign of clearing. Jacob says more clouds gathering from the northwest." What no one yet realized was that this was merely the beginning of what meteorological historians would later document as one of the most severe winters recorded in the region during the entire century. As December progressed, the snow continued relentlessly. The community found itself increasingly isolated, with roads to neighboring settlements becoming impassable. The typically reliable monthly supply wagons from Cleveland failed to arrive. By Christmas, food stocks remained adequate in most households, but concerns about the duration of winter began to surface in correspondence and journal entries from the period. A letter from Millfield's school teacher, Mary Abernathy, to her sister in Pittsburgh, dated January 4, 1837, described conditions. "The snow stands higher than any man in town can reach. We have not seen the sun in 23 days. Some speak of running short on certain provisions, though immediate hunger is not yet upon us." Mr. Thornton says he's never seen such a winter in all his years, and he counts 64 of them. The first signs of trouble with meat preservation appeared in late December, though the full extent of the problem wouldn't become apparent until mid-January. The earliest documented concern appears in the diary of William Foster, a farmer whose property adjoined Josiah Thornton's larger estate. His entry from December 27th notes, "Checked the meat barrels today. Something amiss with the pork from the spotted sow, discoloration at the edges, and smell not quite right. Used less salt than usual due to the shortage. May have been insufficient. Will monitor closely." Similar observations begin to appear in other personal accounts as December turns to January. The common thread in these entries is the recognition that the reduced salt allocations, a consequence of the community's rationing system, had compromised the effectiveness of the preservation process. In some households, meat that should have remained safely preserved for months was showing signs of spoilage barely weeks after butchering. By mid-January, the situation had deteriorated significantly. Township records, meticulously maintained by Clerk Samuel Winters, even during this crisis, note the first community meeting held to address dwindling supplies on January 18th. The minutes record a troubling discovery. In several households, meat preserved with salt was showing signs of spoilage despite the cold. Investigations revealed that in the rush to preserve adequate meat with limited salt supplies, many families had used insufficient quantities, allowing bacterial growth despite the cold conditions. The phenomenon wasn't universal. Some families' meat stores remained perfectly preserved, but the pattern was clear enough to cause alarm. Nearly 1/3 of the settlement's winter meat supply was compromised or at risk. Community leaders faced a frightening prospect: potential meat shortages before winter's end, with no clear means of replenishment until trails became passable again. The meeting minutes capture the growing sense of crisis. J. Thornton reports significant concerns regarding meat preservation in multiple households. Estimates approximately 1/3 of community meat stores showing signs of inadequate preservation. Discussion followed regarding possible remedies, including reallocation of remaining salt supplies to address most immediate cases, and identification of households with surplus that might share with those in need. What's striking in this initial response is the continued focus on salt as the only solution, despite the obvious fact that supplies were insufficient for the need. The community's conceptual framework remained so centered on salt preservation that even in the face of its failure, alternatives weren't yet being seriously considered. It was at this critical juncture that attention finally turned to the 3 families on the ridge. Township records from a January 23rd emergency meeting note T. Henderson, J. Weber, and L. Parker called to address assembly regarding their success in preserving meats without conventional salting. Considerable interest shown in their methods given current circumstances. This moment marks a significant shift in the community's approach. After months of disregarding Henderson's earlier warnings and showing little interest in alternative preservation techniques, the settlement now faced a situation where these previously dismissed methods represented perhaps their only hope for avoiding severe food shortages before winter's end. The detailed descriptions of these alternative preservation methods, captured in both official records and personal accounts, provide us with remarkable insight into techniques that had been largely overlooked or dismissed by the majority of settlers who relied on salt. These methods, born of different cultural traditions and wilderness experience, would now become the community's focus of intense interest. The most immediately applicable method came from Johann Weber, whose family tradition of smoke preservation had roots in Bavarian practice. The township record includes his description. A proper smokehouse needs no salt if built correctly and used with understanding. The meat must hang so no piece touches another. The smoke must be cool enough. Hot smoke cooks, but does not preserve. The hardwood matters greatly. Hickory, maple, or oak provides proper smoke compounds that settle into the meat and prevent spoilage. Weber's presentation to the community, documented in multiple personal accounts including Mary Abernathy's detailed letter to her sister, dated January 24th, went far beyond these basics. According to Abernathy's description, the German gentleman explained with remarkable precision how the smoke must never rise above a certain temperature, which he measures by hanging a special type of resin that melts at the exact point the smoke becomes too warm. He described how the fire must be maintained for no less than 7 days of continuous smoking, and how different woods produce different compounds that preserve the meat in various ways. His knowledge on the matter seems as precise as any science taught at university. What Weber described and what his family demonstrated to increasingly interested neighbors was a form of cold smoking that relied not on salt, but on compounds in the smoke itself, what we now know as phenols and other antimicrobial substances, to preserve the meat. Weber's smokehouse, a careful construction with specific dimensions recorded in Samuel Winter's notes, maintained temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to prevent cooking while allowing smoke penetration. The Weber family's records show they had preserved nearly 300 pounds of pork and venison this way, and by January it remained perfectly edible. Subsequent journal entries from multiple community members indicate expeditions to the Weber homestead to observe their technique, with several families attempting to construct similar smokehouses, despite the challenging conditions. Elizabeth Parker's method, influenced by her time among Shawnee communities, presented a different approach. Her diary provides a detailed account of the preparation of what she called journey cake, but what anthropologists recognize as pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat and rendered fat that could last for extraordinary periods without spoilage. Her January 26, 1837 diary entry, apparently written as she demonstrated the technique to neighboring women, provides a remarkable procedural account. The meat must first be cut very thin, across the grain, not with it. It must dry completely, not just surface dry, but through and through dry, which takes considerably longer than one might expect. Once brittle enough to snap, it must be pounded fine, almost to powder. The fat, rendered clean of all tissue, is melted and mixed with the meat powder in equal measure. Some add dried berries if available, though we have none this season. Pressed firm into birch containers, it will keep longer than any salt meat I've known. Parker's demonstration, attended by 7 women from the settlement, according to her diary, generated significant interest, but also skepticism. She records one attendee's reaction. Mrs. Thornton questioned whether such a method could truly preserve meat without corrupting its taste or wholesomeness. I offered her a portion prepared last winter, now a full year old, yet perfectly edible. Her surprise upon tasting it was most gratifying, though she remained uncertain whether her family would accept such unfamiliar fare. This resistance to unfamiliar food preparations, even in the face of potential shortage, reveals how deeply cultural preferences shaped responses to the crisis. Even as some families embraced these alternative techniques out of necessity, others hesitated, hoping to avoid both the unfamiliar methods and their resulting products until absolutely forced by circumstances. What Parker described was a method that eliminated bacterial growth through complete dehydration, then created an oxygen barrier through the addition of rendered fat. Modern food science confirms this approach creates an environment hostile to bacterial growth, and historical accounts suggest pemmican could remain edible for years or even decades. Thomas Henderson's approach differed from both Weber's and Parker's, relying primarily on controlled temperature and air circulation. Township records indicate significant interest in his method, which required less specialized equipment than Weber's smokehouse and less intensive preparation than Parker's pemmican. Henderson had constructed what he called a winter meat house, a specially designed shed positioned to catch prevailing winds. The structure, detailed in Samuel Winter's notes from his inspection, featured slatted walls that allowed airflow while preventing snow accumulation on the hanging meat. The crucial innovation was a series of baffles that directed cold air around the hanging meat cuts without allowing direct precipitation contact. Henderson explained that meat hung properly in such a structure would develop a protective external layer through dehydration while remaining tender inside. His method relied on consistent cold temperatures, ideally between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, to inhibit bacterial growth while the meat underwent a natural aging process. What Henderson had effectively created, though he wouldn't have used this terminology, was a controlled, dry aging environment that mimicked the conditions that naturally preserve meat in cold, dry climates. Mary Abernathy's letter describes the community's reaction to Henderson's presentation. The most remarkable aspect of Mr. Henderson's method is its simplicity compared to the others, yet it requires the most precise understanding of how air must move around the meat. Several men inspected his structure today, taking measurements and noting its orientation to prevailing winds. Mr. Thornton, who initially seemed skeptical of all these methods, appeared most interested in this approach, perhaps because it seems most familiar to conventional practices, yet requires no salt. A fourth method, though less extensively documented than the three primary approaches, also emerged during this period of knowledge sharing. Township records mention a demonstration by Rachel Turner, whose family had recently arrived from Kentucky, of a preservation technique using honey. The brief notation in the January 30th minutes states, Mrs. Turner demonstrated meat preservation using honey coating, a method she reports was employed by her grandmother in Southern Territories. Sample provided appeared well preserved, though quantity prepared was small. Method requires significant honey supplies, limiting its application given current stores. This tantalizing reference to honey preservation represents another traditional approach that had survived in specific family practices but hadn't been widely shared. The technique, which modern food science confirms can be effective due to honey's antimicrobial properties and its ability to create an oxygen barrier similar to fat in pemmican, apparently remained a minor contribution to the community's preservation efforts, likely due to limited honey supplies during winter. As February arrived with no break in the winter's severity, the community began implementing these alternative preservation methods with increasing urgency. Township records document a communal effort to construct a large smokehouse based on Weber's design. Meanwhile, several families with compromised meat supplies began converting their remaining usable meat into pemmican, following Parker's instructions. Others, with Henderson's guidance, adapted existing outbuildings into drying structures. William Foster's diary provides a detailed account of one family's adoption of these techniques. His entry from February 3rd notes, completed construction of smoking chamber, following Weber's specifications as closely as materials allowed. Design differs somewhat from traditional smokehouse, particularly in firebox placement and ventilation control. Weber inspected our work today and suggested several adjustments to improve smoke circulation. Began smoking process with remaining quarter of beef showing no signs of spoilage. Weber advises minimum 7 days of continuous smoking for proper preservation. A subsequent entry from February 11th records, smoking completed today. Meat appears properly preserved according to Weber's description. Dark exterior but not blackened. Firm to touch but not hardened throughout. Distinctive aroma unlike anything from our previous preservation attempts. Weber examined the results and pronounced them satisfactory though not perfect. Says the meat should remain wholesome until spring if kept in the proper conditions. A remarkable achievement given our amateur attempt at his method. Elizabeth Parker's diary similarly documents her instruction of neighboring women in pemmican preparation. Her February 5th entry notes, third demonstration of journey cake preparation this week. The women grow more confident in the technique, though some still rush the drying process. Emphasized again the critical importance of complete dehydration before fat addition. Mrs. Abernathy shows particular aptitude for the method and has successfully prepared several pounds using venison her husband had fortunately kept frozen in their storehouse rather than salt preserved. These community efforts represented a remarkable adaptation under pressure, the rapid adoption of unfamiliar techniques requiring significant skill and precision, guided by the few practitioners who had maintained these alternative traditions. The historical record shows these efforts were not universally successful. Several attempts at smoking resulted in meat that was insufficiently preserved due to improper temperature control or inadequate smoke penetration. Some pemmican preparations spoiled because the meat wasn't fully dehydrated before fat was added, and some dry aging attempts failed when temperatures fluctuated too widely or humidity wasn't properly controlled. A particularly detailed account of these challenges appears in Samuel Winter's personal journal, separate from his official township records. His February 8th entry recounts third family reports spoilage in their smoking attempt. Investigation reveals similar error to previous failures. Fire maintained too hot, cooking the meat rather than smoking it properly. Weber explains the distinction requires constant vigilance, especially for those unfamiliar with the process. The failures discourage some, but necessity drives continued attempts. Those who succeed share their preserved meat with those who do not, an arrangement that sustains the community, though not without tension. This observation highlights a critical aspect of the community's response to the crisis, the emergence of shared resources and knowledge, but also the inevitable strains this placed on social bonds. The families who had prepared adequately, either through sufficient salt or successful alternative methods, found themselves supporting those who had not. This created new interdependencies and obligations that reshaped community relationships. Mary Abernathy's letters document this social dimension of the crisis. Her February 12th letter observes, "A curious social reorganization unfolds before my eyes. Families previously prominent due to their landholdings or connections now depend on the goodwill of those they once regarded as peripheral to community affairs. The Weber family, once viewed with slight suspicion due to their foreign ways, now find themselves sought after daily for advice and assistance. Mrs. Parker, previously considered somewhat peculiar for her interest in Indian ways, now hosts regular gatherings where women eagerly learn her techniques. These shifting relations cause some discomfort among those unaccustomed to seeking rather than providing assistance. Yet, despite these setbacks and social tensions, the community's pivot toward salt-free preservation methods yielded enough success to significantly mitigate what might otherwise have been a catastrophic food shortage. By March, when supplies would have been critically low, had the community relied solely on their partially compromised salt-preserved stores, These alternative methods had produced enough viable preserved meat to sustain the population. William Foster's diary entry from March 15th provides a community assessment. Township meeting today addressed food supplies. Thornton reports approximately two-thirds of families now have adequate provisions to last until trails clear, assuming no later than mid-April. Remaining thirds subsisting through shared resources and carefully rationed stores. Without the alternative preservation methods demonstrated by Weber, Parker, and Henderson, our situation would be dire indeed. Even Thornton, initially skeptical, now acknowledges their methods saved many from potential starvation. The winter of 1836-1837 finally released its grip on Millfield in early April, nearly 2 weeks later than typical for the region. The first supply wagons arrived on April 11th, bringing with them not only fresh provisions, but also news of similar hardships in neighboring settlements, some of which had fared significantly worse without knowledge of alternative preservation methods. A letter from Cleveland merchant Harrison Wells to Samuel Chadwick, dated April 20th, and preserved in Chadwick's business correspondence, provides external confirmation of Millfield's relative success. Reports from settlements throughout the Western Reserve indicate varying degrees of hardship this past winter. Several communities north of Chardon experienced severe shortages, with at least 2 documented cases of starvation. Your settlement's adaptation to the salt shortage represents a notable achievement. I would be interested to learn more about these alternative preservation methods you mention, as similar shortages may affect other communities in future seasons. This correspondence reveals that Millfield's experience had already begun to attract attention from beyond its boundaries. The community's successful adaptation to crisis through alternative preservation methods would soon influence practices throughout the region. The community's experience that winter had profound and lasting effects on their approach to meat preservation. Township records from September 1837 show a significantly different approach to winter preparation, with multiple families incorporating smoking, pemmican making, and dry aging into their preservation practices, alongside traditional salting. The record notes, salt barrels purchased this season, 17, compared with 42 for the previous year. J. Weber reports 6 new smokehouses constructed since spring thaw. L. Parker held 4 demonstrations of journey cake preparation since August. T. Henderson advises 5 families on proper construction of winter meat houses. This quantifiable shift in community practice, from 42 salt barrels to 17, alongside the proliferation of alternative methods, represents a remarkable adaptation in response to the previous winter's crisis. Rather than returning to exclusive reliance on salt preservation once supplies normalized, the community had fundamentally transformed its approach, incorporating multiple methods to create greater resilience. Perhaps most tellingly, the community's new approach to meat preservation became codified in a document that Samuel Winters titled Millfield Provisions Protocol, dated October 1837. This remarkable historical artifact, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, outlines a community-wide strategy that incorporated all 3 alternative preservation methods alongside traditional salting, with specific recommendations for each household based on their resources and circumstances. The document begins with a statement that encapsulates the lesson learned. No family shall rely solely upon a single method of meat preservation, as each has its vulnerabilities. Wisdom suggests division of provision across multiple methods to ensure winter security regardless of particular challenges that may arise. This principle, essentially an early form of risk diversification in food security, represented a significant evolution in frontier thinking. Rather than simply identifying the best preservation method and standardizing it, the community recognized that environmental, economic, and practical challenges could compromise any single approach. Their response was to develop competency across multiple preservation techniques, creating resilience through diversity of practice. The protocol goes on to outline specific recommendations for different types of meat and different family circumstances. For households with limited labor available, certain methods were emphasized over others. For those with particular skill sets, their expertise was channeled toward specific techniques that they would then share with neighbors. One particularly interesting section addresses knowledge transmission, stating, "Each household practicing a preservation method shall instruct at least one other household in that same method annually, ensuring knowledge remains widely distributed rather than confined to few practitioners." This systematic approach to knowledge sharing, ensuring techniques wouldn't be lost if particular families moved away or faced misfortune, demonstrates remarkable foresight about the importance of maintaining diverse practices across generations. The document essentially created a community-wide system of food preservation that distributed both the labor and the resulting products in ways that maximized collective security. The historical record indicates this approach spread beyond Millfield in subsequent years. County Fair records from 1840 show demonstrations of multiple preservation techniques, including a special exhibition of meat preservation without salt that featured smoking, pemmican making, and dry aging demonstrations. By 1845, regional agricultural journals were publishing articles on these methods, often referencing the Millfield approach to diverse meat preservation. A particularly significant document from this period is a report published in the Western Reserve Agricultural Quarterly in 1843, authored by agricultural researcher Jeremiah Holcomb. After visiting Millfield and several surrounding communities, Holcomb documented the spread of alternative preservation methods throughout the region. His report notes, "The practice of diversifying meat preservation techniques originating in the Millfield settlement following the harsh winter of 1836-37 has now been adopted by no fewer than 14 communities in the Western Reserve." This approach, incorporating European smoking techniques, Native American pemmican preparation, and controlled dry aging methods, produces not only greater food security, but also a wider variety of meat products suited to different culinary applications. Holcomb's report goes on to document specific adaptations and innovations that had emerged as these practices spread. Some communities had developed hybrid approaches combining elements of different methods. Others had adapted the techniques for different types of meat or different seasonal conditions. The report presents this proliferation of methods as evidence of frontier innovation and adaptation, highlighting how knowledge from diverse cultural traditions had been integrated into new practices suited to local conditions. The winter of 1836-1837 and its aftermath illustrate something profound about frontier adaptation and survival. The community's initial resistance to alternative preservation methods, despite the presence of knowledgeable practitioners in their midst, nearly resulted in catastrophe. Only when traditional methods proved vulnerable did the settlement's perspective shift, allowing them to recognize the value in preservation approaches they had previously dismissed or overlooked. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout American frontier history. Innovations critical to survival often existed within communities long before crisis made their adoption necessary. The knowledge held by the Webbers, Parkers, and Hendersons, informed by different cultural traditions and experiences, had always been available to the broader community, yet it required the catalyst of necessity for that knowledge to be fully valued and integrated into community practice. What's particularly notable about the Millfield case is not just that the community adopted these alternative techniques during crisis, but that they maintained and institutionalized them afterward. Rather than reverting to exclusive reliance on salt preservation once supplies normalized, they recognized the inherent resilience in maintaining multiple approaches. This represents a deeper form of adaptation, not just responding to immediate necessity, but transforming their fundamental approach to food security based on lessons learned. The story of Millfield's transformation continued to influence regional practices for decades. The County Historical Society archives contain numerous references to the Millfield approach in agricultural publications through the 1850s and 1860s. Several of the families central to our story, including the Rubbers and Parkers, became regional authorities on food preservation, frequently demonstrating their techniques at county fairs and agricultural exhibitions. Johann Weber's smokehouse design, initially sketched for his neighbors during the crisis, was published in The Ohio Farmer in 1848, accompanied by detailed instructions that had been refined through years of community practice. Elizabeth Parker's pemmican technique was similarly documented in The American Agriculturalist in 1852, described as a native preservation method adapted for frontier application. These publications spread knowledge of these techniques far beyond the immediate region, influencing preservation practices throughout the expanding western frontier. Census records from 1850 show that Millfield had grown into a prosperous settlement, with nearly twice the population it had during that pivotal winter. The community's enhanced resilience in food preservation undoubtedly contributed to its stability and growth. More remarkably, County Agricultural Society records indicate Millfield became somewhat renowned for its preserved meat products, with smoked hams and pemmican from the settlement commanding premium prices in Cleveland markets. The winter that had nearly devastated the community ultimately transformed it, not merely by forcing adaptation to alternative preservation methods, but by fundamentally changing how the settlement approached knowledge and tradition. The Millfield Provisions Protocol evolved over subsequent decades but maintained its core principle: resilience through diversity of practice and openness to multiple traditions. Looking back from our modern perspective, the story of Millfield's transformation offers profound insights into how communities adapt and evolve. The settlement's journey from nearly catastrophic food insecurity to enhanced resilience through knowledge diversification mirrors broader patterns in human adaptation to challenging environments. The alternative meat preservation techniques that proved so crucial, smoking without salt, pemmican preparation, and controlled dry aging, were not new innovations. They represented ancient wisdom from different cultural traditions: European smoking techniques, indigenous pemmican preparation, and dry aging methods developed through generations of northern trappers' experience. What was innovative was the community's eventual willingness to transcend cultural boundaries and integrate these diverse approaches into a coherent strategy for survival. In the decades following that pivotal winter, as Millfield's approach to meat preservation spread throughout the region, families who adopted these diverse techniques gained significantly enhanced food security. Agricultural records show that during subsequent harsh winters or periods of salt scarcity, communities that had embraced the Millfield approach demonstrated remarkable resilience. The most powerful testament to the lasting impact of this transformation appears in an 1862 letter from Elizabeth Parker, by then an elderly woman, to her granddaughter. The letter, preserved by descendants and later donated to the County Historical Society, reflects on the long-term significance of that pivotal winter. What seemed our greatest trial proved our greatest blessing, for it taught us to value wisdom from all sources. The journey cake method I learned from Morning Skies people, once viewed as primitive by my neighbors, saved many from hunger that winter. Since then, our community has never relied solely on a single approach to securing our food, recognizing that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. Remember this lesson, child. No single tradition holds all answers. Look always to diverse knowledge, especially from those whose ways differ from your own. This perspective, recognizing the value of diverse knowledge sources and the danger of over-reliance on familiar but potentially vulnerable methods, represents the deepest lesson from the Millfield experience. The community's initial resistance to alternative methods reflected a common human tendency to privilege familiar traditions over unfamiliar ones, even when the familiar contains hidden vulnerabilities. Their eventual embrace of multiple approaches demonstrates how crisis can sometimes catalyze beneficial transformations in community practice. The techniques themselves deserve closer examination, as they represent sophisticated preservation methods developed across cultures and generations. Weber's smoking technique, far from the simple smoke exposure sometimes practiced as a supplement to salt preservation, involved precise temperature control, specific wood selection, and carefully managed airflow. These elements created an environment where meat was exposed to preservative compounds in the smoke, while maintaining conditions that inhibited bacterial growth without cooking the meat. Parker's pemmican preparation similarly represented a sophisticated understanding of food preservation principles, though developed through different cultural traditions. By completely dehydrating meat before combining it with rendered fat, this method eliminated the moisture necessary for bacterial growth, while creating an oxygen barrier that prevented spoilage. The resulting product's remarkable shelf stability, with documented cases of pemmican remaining edible for decades, testifies to the effectiveness of this approach. Henderson's dry aging method, influenced by both European and indigenous practices from northern territories, relied on careful environmental control to create conditions where meat naturally developed protective external surfaces while maintaining internal tenderness and flavor. His innovation lay not in the basic principle, which had been known to northern peoples for generations, but in creating a structure that reliably reproduced optimal conditions regardless of external weather variations. What unites these diverse methods is their development through generations of careful observation and adaptation. Each represents accumulated knowledge about how environmental factors, smoke compounds, dehydration, fat barriers, temperature control, affect meat preservation. Though developed in different cultural contexts, each method effectively addresses the fundamental challenges of preventing bacterial growth and oxidation that lead to spoilage. The story of how American pioneers preserved meat through the winter without salt is ultimately not just about food preservation techniques, though these are certainly fascinating in their technical details. It's about how communities adapt and evolve when faced with challenges to established practices. It's about the critical importance of knowledge diversity in creating resilience. And perhaps most importantly, it's about how wisdom often exists within our communities long before we recognize its value, sometimes in traditions or practices we've overlooked or dismissed. The Millfield Settlements experience reminds us that preparation isn't merely about accumulating resources or perfecting a single approach. True preparation involves developing multiple strategies, remaining open to diverse knowledge sources, and recognizing that resilience often comes from unexpected directions. As our modern society faces its own challenges in food security and environmental adaptation, the lessons from this frontier community remain remarkably relevant. The pioneers who learned to preserve meat without salt demonstrated that adaptation often doesn't require new technologies or resources. It requires openness to existing knowledge that we may have previously failed to value. And perhaps most importantly, they showed that the most resilient communities are those that embrace diversity of practice rather than standardization around seemingly optimal but potentially vulnerable solutions. In the quietly kept home ledgers of Millfield families from 1840 and beyond, a common notation appears alongside winter preparation inventories, meat divided across methods as per protocol. This simple phrase represents a profound shift in thinking, from vulnerability through dependency on a single approach to resilience through diversity of practice. It's a lesson that echoed through generations of frontier settlements and one that continues to offer wisdom for our own challenging times. The next time you pass by a smokehouse in rural America or encounter traditional pemmican preparations in cultural demonstrations, remember that these aren't merely quaint historical curiosities. They represent survival knowledge developed across generations and cultural traditions, knowledge that once meant the difference between life and death during the long, unforgiving winters of the American frontier. In that knowledge, preserved like the meat itself through generations, lies a profound reminder of human ingenuity and adaptability in the face of scarcity and challenge. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the wisdom we need for future resilience may already exist around us, waiting to be recognized and valued before necessity forces our hand.